Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, September 28th, 2006. I'm James Spencer, and this is a kind of a special episode of Basic Brewing Radio here in Denver, Colorado. Actually, Englewood, Colorado, suburb of Denver. Is that right, Brian?
That's correct.
We're at Brian Warren's house, and with me is Andy Sparks.
Hey, James. Great to be with you.
And this episode, I was thinking about running the hot side aeration experiment story, an update on the hot side aeration experiment. And we have recorded an interview, an installment of that process, but we had an interview this morning that was quite special, and we wanted to share it with you today. And that was an interview at Charlie Papazian's house with Charlie Papazian himself, who's the kind of pioneer who started the modern homebrewing movement here in the United States. And quite a lot of fun, wasn't it, guys?
Yeah, it was a true thrill for me, James. You know, Charlie Papazian's book, The New Complete Joy of Homebrewing, was the first book on homebrewing I ever read. And, now, 15 years later, I'm definitely still thickly involved in the homebrewing business, and I love it. And, it was very exciting to meet Charlie today and be there at his house.
Well, yeah, James, it was a blast. Just like Andy said, it was the first book that I read about homebrewing, and honestly, it's what got me started. And Charlie's attitude and just his whole take on homebrewing really just helps usher people into homebrewing without freaking them out with all the technical stuff that's really easy to get into. And it was great to relax, not worry, and enjoy a homebrew with Charlie himself.
And to enjoy Charlie's homebrew.
Yeah, of course.
And Charlie was really a gracious host. I mean, you could not have asked for a more gracious host and a more generous guy as far as his knowledge and his time. And we also shot a video interview that will be running on Basic Brewing Video probably in the next couple weeks. So keep an eye out for that. And Andy, we should mention that while we're out here, you are a blogging monster, and you are blogging our experience as we're out here in Denver. And if people want to follow along to what we're doing, where can they go?
It's going to be at gabf2006.blogspot.com. This is my first venture into blogging, so it's a little green, but it should show you what we're up to out here.
So I'll put a link to that on basicbrewingradio.com in the description of this episode, and we should follow along. So without further ado, let's get to the interview with Mr. Charlie Papazian. Charlie Papazian, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Here we are again, drinking beer around the table, and I'm ready to talk beer.
and joining us is Brian Warren.
Hey, James, how's it going?
And Andy Sparks.
Always a treat, especially here next to the creek in Charlie's backyard.
We're sitting out at a picnic table in the sun, beautiful sunshine, and the creek is flowing by, and we want to talk to Charlie a bit about...
You'll each have a glass of homebrew in your hand, too. You have to mention that.
Yeah. And what are we drinking, Charlie?
Well, I'm drinking an ordinary bitter, an English ale, about 3.8% alcohol, and two of you are drinking my Smoketoberfest beer. It's a German-style smoked beer in the spirit of the month that is just about to happen, October. And what is the other beer? Oh, the Corny Donkey is the IPA, which has an amazing passion fruit aroma from the New Zealand Nelson B. Sauvin hops that were dry hopped. I dry hop with.
And I will say, very delicious.
Well, and you were talking before on camera, but it may not make it to the video podcast, about your philosophy of how you experiment. And talk to us about that. What elements of the beer do you play with, and what elements of the beer do you leave alone?
Yeah, as any home brewer has gotten past their first batch of beer knows that, all of a sudden the world of brewing is like never ending. It's like there's all these opportunities that you have access to with different types of sophisticated equipment, hundreds of malts, hundreds of hops, hundreds of different kinds of yeast, barrel aging, oak aging, glass carboy aging, plastic fermenters, techniques, mashing, malt extract, you name it, goes on and on. And so my philosophy, or my approach to home brewing over the years has been to generally stick to one or two different kinds of yeast and vary the ale versus lager fermentation by temperature control. And you really do get a fruitier beer the warmer you ferment, and the colder you ferment, the more lager-like the beer gets, as you guys are experiencing as we're talking about this right now. So I like to really play around with malt and hops. Keep the yeast relatively consistent, and there's just so many different kinds of things that home brewers can do that most professional brewers never have the opportunity to. Craft brewers, they have their little pilot brewery, or they make small batches, and they can make a lot of different kinds of beers, as you know, but home brewers have access to so much more time and so much, much more opportunity, especially if they're brewing in 5-gallon batches, which is what I usually do, 5 or 6. I've seen home brewing systems up to 15 gallons or even bigger, and I'd rather brew more frequently because I love to make beer. I like the process, and I like to have a variety of beer on tap.
And your brewing system, you drug out a pot?
Off the shelf, a 10-gallon stainless steel pot that's going to be with me for the rest of my life. And I actually have a 3-gallon stainless steel pot and a 2-gallon stainless steel pot, depending on, what I'm doing with the grains and such. But it's all hands-on brewing. And I didn't bring down the Phil's Lauder system, this thing that they sell in the homebrew shop, the little plastic bucket with I guess it's stainless false bottom now, but he gave me a prototype back in the early days when he was experimenting on, what do you think, Charlie, about my idea? And I said, this is great. And I'm still using it after 15, 20 years. I'm still using the prototype. And it makes great beer. And I even, a lot of people will be all-grain brewers will be appalled, but I still grind my grain with a Corona grain mill, which is a big no-no because theoretically you grind the grain too much, the integrity of the husk gets ruined. But pardon my ignorance, but I still make great beer. I love my beer, and my friends like my beer, and I get 85% efficiency consistently with my system. It's all hands-on, and I learned a trick the last time I was in my home brew shop, What's Brewing, here in Boulder, Colorado. I know it was around, using rice hulls. I figured, why complicate things? Why add something else? And talking to, the owner there, and he said, I always throw a half pound in. It just makes the mash so much more easy to deal with. And I said, well, I'm going to try it. And since then, I've just been throwing 3 big handfuls of rice hulls into the mash. And, I have a wheat beer that I used 20% of wheat, torrefied wheat, malted wheat, and some, one other kind of wheat grain I put in, and I had no problem with it. Got 87% extraction out of that one.
So it was almost 100% wheat?
No, it was about
25%
wheat. And, and theoretically, wheat, beer, that much wheat, you're going to have problems with clarification. And I lagered it. It was a lager. What I made was a wheat pilsner. Yeah. Drink that in your beer. Wheat pilsner. I just said, well, I never heard of a wheat pilsner. So I made a pilsner beer, formulated the hops, German pilsner malt. And I said, what the hell? I'm going to put in this wheat in there and just see what happens. And I got great extraction, and I lagered it for about 5 weeks, and it's crystal clear. Crystal clear.
Wow.
And, it goes against theory. I have a yeast that I keep going. You guys want to ask me about my yeast earlier. What kind of yeast? I have this, I call it the original culture. If you read in my new book called Microbrewed Adventures. There's a story about the St. Louis experience I had in 1982, where Anheuser-Busch and the Master Brewers Association and the American Society of Brewing Chemists asked me to brew a special batch of beer. And talk about it being intimidated. This was in '82 when the best yeast we could get as home brewers was basically dried yeast, unless you wanted to pay a couple $100 for a yeast slant. Mm-hmm. And I was intimidated as hell, but I just had a few home brews. I said, I can do it. Just like everything else in my life. It's intimidating to have a few glasses of home brew, and then all of a sudden you can conquer the world. Basically, to make a long story short, because the whole story is in my book. It's a pretty fascinating story. But I did get some yeast culture from a brewery, let's say, within the area. And I've, since 1983, this was in 83, I've managed to keep that yeast going in beer. And, I carefully culture it and unwort. And let's say that was 23-year-old yeast. And I recently sent a sample to White Labs yeast to see, they were interested in culturing it, and they did culture it up, and they tested it, and they said it defies all logic. He said the yeast is as clean as it could possibly be, and I said, well, thank you. And I still brew with it. It's a lager yeast. It's a lager yeast that I won't tell you where it originally came from. You have to read my book. It'll blow your mind when you find out. But I use it for my ales, and I use it for my lagers, as I mentioned earlier. You just really warm, 70-degree fermentation with that yeast. You get that fruity character, and it'll lager and keep fermenting at 33 degrees, and you get the smooth lager taste, what you're tasting in that Smoketoberfest. It works.
So that's what you use for everything?
These days, there was a period of time I was using White Labs English Ale yeast and Y yeast 1275 Thames Valley yeast and I was making great beer with that as well, and replenishing after every 4 or 5 batches. I get a fresh pack or a fresh vial, and I was using German lager yeast and Pilsner yeast. I experimented with lots of different yeasts, and no doubt about it, I was making great beer with those yeasts, and it made a little bit of a difference, the nuances in the beer. But I was wanting to get back to seeing what the malt and the hops did. And if you're always changing your yeast, you'll never know what the malts and hops can do. And I really, I'll be the malt and hops guru and not the yeast guru. There are other people that are the yeast gurus.
Well, I can't let you go on without asking you how you keep a yeast strain healthy and alive for decades. How do you do it?
You look in the Complete Joy of Home Brewing. There is it's about a 7 or 8 page section about culturing yeast, and basically I boil up a wort, add lots of hops to it, I strain it out, I put the hot boiling wort into glass bottles that are preheated, and I'll cap it up so it's sterile, sanitized wort in beer bottles, let it cool, put it in the refrigerator. I have a half a year supply of culture, and I have mason jars, which are sanitized, and I have corks that fit the mason jar opening, and I'll use that cultured wort, or not the cultured wort, the boiled wort, the sanitized wort, and carefully pour it into, and just keep it going in the same container. I'll never recycle wort from a batch and think that I can keep the yeast clean, because as home brewers, your beer may taste perfectly clean, and it may last months and maybe a year in a keg or bottles, but there is bacteria in there, and there is wild yeast. And if you're going to do cultures, you got to be even more. You got to be really as extreme as you need to get in home brewing. And really, the sanitizing part, I have, a half a pint of Everclear alcohol, people say, "What do you use that for?" And probably it'll last me a few years, actually. I have Q-tips, and I swab with alcohol the surfaces, wherever. You got to just think. And I'm pouring the yeast from one container to another. What is it touching? It's obviously touching the outside surface of the bottle. I mean, it's not just the lip, but it kind of goes over. You got to swab wherever it's coming in contact with. And there was a time years ago when my cultured yeast became contaminated with a phenolic taste, that Band-Aid type character, and it obviously got contaminated with wild yeast. And I basically didn't brew with that yeast for 3 or 4 or 5 years because I knew it was contaminated, and I went to the cultured yeast. And after 3, 4 years, it just sat there. I said, theoretically this yeast is dead, but I know better than that better than theory, so I basically cultured it up again and brewed a simple batch of beer, and it was clean beer. What my theory is that over the many years, the strain of yeast that I had been culturing was much more resistant to the rigors of time, and the wild yeast didn't survive because I did keep it on alcohol. I didn't freeze it. I didn't put it on a slant. And wild yeast probably couldn't adapt to the alcohol. The 4% couldn't tolerate it, so it gradually went the way of the dodo. And my cultured beer yeast, which was accustomed to being in alcohol for its entire life, was resistant. And after 2 days, I saw activity. I said yes, and I revived it without washing it with acid washes or slanting or anything like that. So, there are ways to do it. Keep it simple.
Keep it simple. So, do you have any favorite myths about home brewing that you ignore and go against? And what are some of those?
They're not myths. They're just, you just got to remember that you're home brewing and that your beer is going from pot to carboy and carboy to keg and keg to the refrigerator, and it isn't really leaving your home. So there's a lot of very grounded, valid, legitimate homebrew lore out there. Let's just take one for example. Hot side aeration. If you're all grain brewing, hot side aeration is the process of when you transfer wort or you transfer your mash and you're aerating it, and that forms precursors, compounds that will later stale. And that is very, very important when you're a commercial brewery. And your beer goes into a bottle, and it goes on the shelf, it goes on a truck, it goes into high temperatures, low temperatures, goes into the car trunk of a car, who knows where it goes. And you want your beer to be as stable as possible and survive the rigors of getting it from the brewery to a beer drinker's mouth. Home brewing, it doesn't suffer what commercial beer suffers. So, my beers, some of my beers will be in a keg for 5 or 6 months, and they'll be refrigerated the whole time, and they're as fresh as when they were originally put in, and they don't get stale. And my bottled beers, they don't get stale. And you should see, I'm ladling with a pot my hot mash from one container to another, and there's plenty of air that goes into that. One of the little tidbits I offer people when I give presentations and when I'm being interviewed on the radio, or in a case like this, is I put about maybe a half teaspoon or a teaspoon of cinnamon into my mash, almost every mash. And I learned that from a professor of brewing from the Netherlands, in Holland. And he said, in the old days, brewers always used to put a little coriander, a little bit of herbs, and there are certain things that you can put in that are very antioxidant, and cinnamon is one of those, and coriander is as well, a little bit stronger taste. And brewers, they have aids that they can buy. There's certain kinds of ground up bark that they can use, like cinnamon is a bark. It has very, very high in tannin. You add that to your mash, or other stages, it helps stabilize it adds stability to the beer. So, in theory, I don't know if it's really making a difference because I don't have the analysis and I've never done a control and did tests side by side, but my beer stays fresh. And I don't worry about hot side aeration because of all the things I've said. And the insurance is a little bit of cinnamon in my mash. And I did have noticed, if any of people who are listening to this interview, if you brew with coriander in a beer, like whip beer, and you happen to have a 1 or 2 or 3 year old bottle of this stuff, have you ever noticed that it tastes pretty damn fresh compared to any English style ale or a Pilsner that you've done? And that got me to thinking about the coriander part of it. And that's what led me to go up to the professor and say, I have some beer that I made with coriander that just never seems to go stale. And he says, that's a very good point. And cinnamon is even a better herb, a better spice to use. And that's where I got the cinnamon hint.
But you can't really perceive the cinnamon in the finished batch.
No, by the time you mash and boil for an hour, it's gone. There was concern. I told that to a brewer, and he says, it's excellent. It's very good, but you're going to get a cinnamon taste in your beer. And I said, I don't have cinnamon taste in my beer. And, I heard that one of the largest breweries in the world that happens to be based in this country was experimenting with cinnamon years ago, about 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. And when the boss got wind of the notion that the brewers were experimenting with cinnamon, they say he stopped that immediately because they had a reputation that they wanted to uphold, and they didn't want consumers thinking that they were putting cinnamon in their beer. So he squashed that. But even brewers, very schooled brewers, have played with that whole notion.
That's funny. Brian has participated in an experiment with hot side aeration where he basically beat the crap out of his beer with a whisk. and there were some perceived differences, but I guess the takeaway from the experiment was basically if you are relatively careful with your beer, you just don't have to worry about that. What's another one? What's another sort of thing that people may worry too much about? I mean, they should be relaxing and having a home brew and not worrying. What's something is there something that you can think of that people stress out too much about?
I'm thinking about this as I take another sip of beer, see if I can get inspired.
Or we may want to come back to that.
Let me get back to that. Yeah, let me just kind of mull that over in the back of my mind as we ask me another question, because I can't really think of. The hot side aeration. That people talk about first wort hopping. Putting hops in the beginning.
Yeah, let's talk about that. What's your opinion about first wort hopping?
I do it. I put hops in the kettle before I start putting the wort in. So gradually, they say it stabilizes some certain hop compounds. I haven't done any controlled hop experiments to really know. Some people swear by it. Others say it's a bunch of baloney. I guess if some people swear by it and they're reputable brewers, then there's something to it. And that the other brewers just don't want to take the time to really experiment with and discover on their own. Here, I can think of one. Decoction mashing versus infusion mashing or step mashing. There are some professors out there and well-schooled brewers that say it doesn't make a damn bit of difference between decoction mashing and doing a single-step infusion. But every time you go to Germany and you discover not the watered-down German lager that they're starting to make now, but the traditional, there's a taste to that beer. Their Pilsners, their Munich Helleses, their Bock beers that is distinct from what virtually 99% of American craft brewers are trying to do with their infusion mashes. The taste makes the difference. You go to Germany, it's so consistent. You get that bready, very malty, bready underlying foundation of the beer that I just can't help but think it is the decoction mash that contributes to it, because you go into most brew pubs and you taste most commercially made craft beers. They're great lagers, German-style beers, but they don't have that foundation that Germans have consistently. So I think there is something. What I do as a brewer because I've done decoction mashing in my earlier years, and it's just so time-consuming, and I'd rather be drinking beer and just enjoying the brewing process rather than stressing out about moving mashes around. What I have found really works well to get very close to the decoction mash character is add 3 to 4% of aromatic malt. And I use Belgian aromatic malt. And that aromatic character, the flavor and the aroma, replicates to a certain degree that German decoction mash character. And so I'm pretty pleased with that. So is it a myth? I think there's something to it. But you don't have to do a decoction mash to approach it. You can play around like I spent my time playing around with malts. And that's one of the malts that I consistently add to my lagers, whether it's a Hella style or a Bohemian style Pils or German style Pils. I'll always add a little bit of aromatic malt to give that underlying foundation to make it more European character, traditional European character.
So there are things, I mean, if something has worked for a style for generations, there's probably something in why they keep doing it.
Yeah, originally it was because the malt was of poor quality, and in order to get the extract efficiency, they had to go through this process because I think it was under-modified, and it was, the protein content. They just had to do it to get that character of beer. And, there's a myth out there that, well, it's not a myth, but I have written about it. It's you can get malt that's maybe not the best quality, but you can make great beer with it. And when brewers, be careful when brewers say best quality, because best quality to professional brewers, and especially the larger they get, best quality means that you can manage the malt and the mash and it doesn't get stuck, and you get great efficiencies, and you have better stability in the beer. And that's the qualities that they're integrating into their decision on what good quality malt is. And obviously, 100 years ago, the malt quality was not the same as it was these days, and it probably wouldn't be suitable to the brewing systems, very sophisticated brewing systems that brewers have today. So it's poor quality malt, but it was great quality malt then, and beer drinkers loved the beer then. And you can make great beer. You just need to adapt your process, your fermentation, your mashing regime, and all that, your temperature, whatever, your grain crushing. You have to adapt to the malt. So if it's reasonably, I'm not saying if it's infested with insects, you don't want to use that stuff. But I give you an example. I did a brew trip through Estonia and Latvia and Russia, and back in 1995, and those were the years when they were just coming out of the Soviet Union, dissolved just shortly before that. And so these breweries had really crappy malt as brewers would look at. You look at the malt, and some of it was sprouting. We saw the malt, and some of it had 1-inch green leaves. They had green leaves coming out of the thing, and others were just beginning to sprout. So the malt was inconsistent, but the beer, fresh from the brewery, which is what home brewing is all about, was delicious. Now, would that brewery withstand and be stable in the marketplace? No. Absolutely not. But fresh from the brewery, it was like, this is the way beer used to taste like. This is like going into the past. This is like, you romanticize when you look at photographs of what that frothy beer tasted like. And it was great. It was just very different than the clean beer that has had so much character taken out of it because it needs to be stable in the marketplace because it's being shipped all over the world.
What do you see, or how do you react to the kind of nowadays the kind of extreme brewers who are making double and triple IPAs and all these wild yeasts and just doing some wacky stuff with the beers? What do you think about that?
Well, it's just like my own home brewing. I brew consistently my ordinary bitter, which is not anything spectacular. It's a great summer drink. I have 3 or 4. My Munich Helles is just kind of a ordinary, everyday German-style Munich Helles lager. They're not spectacular beers. They're not outside the envelope. The ones that I do brew that are outside the envelope, like some of the ones you're tasting, like that Corny Donkey IPA, the one that was there, has a unique hops in the. I have an Imperial Porter that's about 8.5%. That is very low hop, very malty cocoa character. People go bonkers over. And I have a Here to Heaven barley wine that I bottled that is aged with oak. I have lambic beers. Cherry lambics and raspberry lambics and barley wine lambics. I even have a mead that has 15 different herbs in it. Those are the ones that people remember. Those are the ones that people talk. Did you ever try? Oh, that beer that I had that was so good. But most of what we drink are the ordinary, just everyday, very characterful, lots of flavor. But something that's your pal. That's your friend. It's not, it's not the person that you visit once a year that you remember, but it's your everyday pal. And that's, that's what the question you asked has relevance in my home brewing, and I think it has relevance in craft brewing too. It's like, Jim Cook at Boston Beer brews Utopia. I mean, people talk about that if you've ever had it, and you never forget it. You go into his oak cellars and you taste some of the old batches, you never forget that experience. But, there's a million barrels of his Boston lager that people come back to time and time after again. And just like the brew pub, you go into a brew pub, generally, you might go in there and every time you'll get an IPA or your porter, your favorite style, and then you'll say, well, I'm in the mood for something different. I think those extreme beers are for when you are in a different mood than what you normally are. It's something to treat yourself, something special. You feel like, after let's say you just ran a marathon, or you just brewed a batch of beer, or you just cut the grass, or you just had a finish taping an interview, and you just want a beer. Mm-hmm. And you go for something that's your pal. And maybe sometimes when you're more relaxed and the evenings feel special or the occasion feels special and you have the opportunity to try something extreme, you go for it, and then you remember that and you'll want it again, but you won't want it consistently over and over. It's not something you're going to be drinking Worldwide Stout from Sam Calagione's Dogfish Head Brewery, 25% alcohol, every day after you come home from work,
I think that's a great point, because a lot of homebrewers, they'll brew one batch, drink it, towards the end of the keg, they'll brew another batch, and I'm one of those homebrewers, and it's a little hard to want to brew the really big beers because I can't drink that every night, and I can't drink a couple of them every night, but I can sure as heck drink a pail every night. And so it's almost like when I first got into home brewing, I was like, wow, I want to brew the double IPAs. I want to brew the really big stuff. And then I found myself brewing session beers like almost all the time, because I've wanted to start trying brewing where I brew a big beer and then I take the second runnings and brew a session beer, because then I get both, and so, or I just have to brew a lot more so that I can make sure I have those session beers on hand, while I'm waiting for the big beer to do its thing.
Yeah, if you get into brewing those session beers is not necessarily the right term, but yeah, those friendly beers that you're always drinking. you really get into really trying to finesse, just improve it every single time. And after the many years I've been brewing, it's like, okay, a little bit aromatic malt. That pale ale, a little bit, like 2 ounces of Special B, Belgian Special B malt. That malt is so extreme. You use too much and you got an extreme beer. But it adds so much complexity in small amounts. It's something that most brewers aren't doing. So, you add personality to those session beers that keep it interesting, but not an extreme beer. That's what I like to do. Like Melanoidin malt. It's another one. That's a beer available through. It's a German-made malt. It's very red. I'd had an ale that they made at the malt place in Germany, and they made an ale with like 60% of melanoidin malt, which it tasted like a real malty Irish red ale. Really extremely malty, caramelly in a different way. And I've been using a little bit of that in my ordinary bitters, in my pale ales, just to add some complexity. And I also add something called, it's spelled R-A-P, but it's pronounced in Portuguese, rapadura. It's a dried cane syrup, cane juice. And it's a waste sugar like molasses, but it comes in cake form. In Brazil, and every time I go to Brazil, I bring back cakes of that stuff, and I add like a quarter of a pound of that in a 5-gallon batch, and it gives it a kind of a very subtle caramel character to beers that are really low alcohol, and it just gives the low alcohol beers a lot of flavor, which is what I'm looking for, even in my low alcohol beers.
Is it more challenging to do a good low alcohol beer than to do a Wampin, barley wine or something like that?
I wouldn't say it's more challenging to make a good Wamping barley wine. That's smooth and really friendly. You might luck out and do it the first time, especially if you use a recipe out of my book. But it's a finesse. You work at it. See, I didn't like that part of the flavor. I'm going to take that out, and I want a little bit of this. So you just kind of experiment. But you're right. With the lower alcohol beers, it's almost an oxymoron to have flavors in a low alcohol beers, and home brewers have access to being able to do that. And commercially, what brew pub or especially particularly any bottled versions of something that's 4% or less that you can even buy, let alone has any flavor. But as a home brewer, I've had lots of home brews. When I go to the American Home Brewers Association conference or the Beer Fest, the Great American Beer Festival, whenever I see a bitter from a reputable a brewery that I know that has a good reputation, I'll go for it. Because I know that they probably have put flavor in a low alcohol beer, and you just enjoy the evening for a much longer time. You try more beers. You go for the extreme beers. I'm digressing, but drinking beer, you digress from the original book.
Well, we're enjoying the digressing. In watching you in Orlando at club night, walking around and talking to everybody, you really take the opportunity to listen to the home brewers, and it looks like to me that you're still learning, even after all the decades of brewing.
Absolutely. I'm always picking up new ideas. I taste something different in a beer. I say, how did you do that? And they'll tell me something I've never heard of before, or it's some and they're not necessarily extreme beers. I'm just saying, how did you get that? Like I'll taste. There was a brewery at the Home Brewers Conference from a small brewery in Florida, and the best beer at the one I enjoyed wasn't the best. It was the one I was enjoying the most was an ordinary bitter, and it tasted so good. And I was trying to identify the hops, and I suspected what it was, but I had to ask, and I just. I can't remember the hop right now, so I'm no use to this interview. But it was a hop that I hadn't considered using before, So I said, oh, I'm going to have to remember that. And now I forgot. But, maybe because I had some extreme beers that night, too. But I'm always learning. And not only home brewing, professional brewers. And you listen to professional brewers and what they're doing. And the thing is, you got to translate it into what its meaning is to home brewers. Because what they do is on such a large scale and a different scale. You got to think, okay, how does this translate? How does this process translate to home brewing? Mm-hmm. You don't want to duplicate exactly what they're doing. You got to think about what you're doing, the scale, your efficiencies, the stability, the opportunity to have a stable beer, and not necessarily be doing a few of the things that they have to do. They filter their beer. Do home brewers have to filter? No, especially if you have the patience, just let it sit for 2 or 3 weeks longer in a cooler environment, and it clears. Mm-hmm.
Well, Charlie, we certainly appreciate your hospitality, and we appreciate your inspiration over the years, and it's a wonderful hobby, and I think there are a lot of people out there who are grateful for your influence.
Yeah, well, I encourage people to continue home brewing, experiment, support their local homebrew supply stores, because I really appreciate the one here in Boulder that I can go in and pick up stuff and get even ideas from them, like the rice hull idea. It wasn't an idea, something I just was ignoring, but then it kind of got slapped in the face with it. It's like, homebrew shops serve as a community, a focal point of where people go. And I've been to so many different communities where there used to be homebrew shops, and they don't exist anymore. And the homebrew club, it's kind of falls apart. And so, pay a little bit more. It's just like paying more for craft beer. There's value in that. And there's value in supporting your homebrew supply store and joining the American Homebrewers Association at beertown.org.
And if you forget the address, we'll put a link to it on our website.
Great.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks. We wish we had time to drink a few more beers.
Well, there you go. Thanks again to Charlie Papazian, and thanks again to Brian Warren and to Andy Sparks for helping us out with doing the Charlie Papazian interview, and just a wonderful experience. And we'll have more from Colorado, from Denver, lots of exciting stuff coming up in the weeks to come. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And while you're on our site, you can check out our online shop, where you can find great pricing on our DVDs and a combo deal to save you even more. In our first DVD, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process step by step. And in Basic Brewing, Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort, including infusion mashing, step mashing, and fly sparging, and batch sparging as well. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com, and if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it from us online. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer.
This is Andy Sparks.
I'm Brian Warren.
Thanks for listening. Basic Brewing Radio production help is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.